By all appearances, Hollywood was picture perfect. The shameful reality, however, was not lost on Henry Fonda. He was physically assaulted on film, betrayed by his best friend, tormented by studios who were after his authority, and ensnared in a nightmare after appearing in The Grapes of Wrath. The stunning altercation with the director was more than simply a physical altercation. After years of abuse that Hollywood attempted to conceal, it was the tipping point. Here today, we spill the beans on the devastating Hollywood feud that devastated one of the most iconic American actors and left him feeling alone, furious, and shattered. Grand Island, Nebraska was the site of Henry Fonda's birth on May 16, 1905. He came from a long line of noblemen. The family Fonda originated in the 1400s in Genoa, Italy. As a result of persecution, they took refuge in Holland before making the journey to the Americas in the early 1600s. They were among the earliest Dutch settlers in the United States and helped build Fonda, a little hamlet in upstate New York. Joe Fonda, an ancestor of Henry's, was murdered in a raid, but the family continued on. A humble upbringing was Henry's reality. His dad had a job in the printing and advertising industries. Christian Science was his family's faith, and they avoided medical professionals in favor of prayer. Henry kept to himself. He was reclusive, particularly with girls he didn't know from his family, although he enjoyed skating, swimming, and jogging. The parts he performed in films were influenced by his introverted demeanor. There was one incident from his youth that he will never forget. He was 14 years old when he saw Will Brown brutally lynched during the Omaha racial riots of 1919. He was stunned to see the brutal murder of an innocent guy by a mob. It changed his perspective on life by exposing him to the truth of racial injustice. The folks who fought for justice in his subsequent roles were inspired by that experience. Acting was never Henry's career goal. His first career goal was to work in journalism. He went to the University of Minnesota to study journalism after graduating from Omaha Central High School in 1923. As a result of his father's insistence, Henry worked 2 jobs while he was in school. In addition to his position at Northwestern Bell Telephone Company, he was a physical education teacher. After 2 years, he decided to drop out of school since juggling employment in school was too hard. He returned to Omaha and tried his luck in the journalistic industry. What followed was a complete surprise. He was encouraged to pursue acting by Dottie Brando, who was a friend of his mother's and the mother of Marlon Brando, a future Hollywood star. At the Omaha Community Playhouse, she urged him to try out for an audition. Despite Henry's lack of experience in the field, he decided to give acting a go. He was cast as Ricky in the film You and I. He was uncertain about his place on stage at first. While rehearsing, he overcame his anxiety and lack of self-confidence. An attraction to performing that he had never experienced before overcame all other interests. Being on stage wasn't the only thing that mattered. The theater was his favorite place in the world. He picked up as much knowledge as he could while assisting with set construction and seating guests. His father was not pleased by his newfound interest. After seeing Henry perform, he began to regard acting as a legitimate profession. He saw that his son was talented. Henry's destiny was sealed. For him, acting was now more than a pastime, it was his calling. He uprooted his life in 1928 and headed for New York City in search of professional acting opportunities. On the same year, he became a member of the summer stock theatrical group on Cape Cod, Massachusetts, known as the University Players Guild. There, he met Margaret Sullivan and James Stewart, 2 individuals whose lives he would never be the same. Henry may have begun with little parts, but he worked tirelessly to grow into his positions. Torna Quincy in The Jest was one of his most memorable parts. As he continued to perform, his self-assurance grew. He stood out with his effortless acting approach. Henry gave performances that seemed genuine, in contrast to the numerous performers of the day who were over the top. Being a part of the university team was crucial to his professional development. His first marriage was likewise a result of this. His brief romance with Margaret Sullivan ended in marriage in 1931. Their bond was unbreakable, even after the split. James Stewart and Henry Stewart moved in together at this time. They couldn't have been more different. Stewart and Fonda were lifelong friends despite their political differences. Fonda was liberal and Stewart was conservative. Henry began to attract attention as he accumulated more experience. A call from Broadway came. His portrayals of the joking character, which he performed for professional audiences, were acclaimed for their sincerity and charisma. The genuineness of his personalities was enhanced by his subtle passion. Interest from Hollywood quickly grew. After enduring the Great Depression for a while, Henry finally got his big break in 1935 with the part of the farmer takes a wife. Fans adored him even though he was hesitant to pursue a career in movies at first. In stark contrast to the hardships he had endured throughout the Great Depression, his weekly compensation increased to $3,000. This is his second feature picture. I Dream Too Much. 1935, shown that he was not your run-of-the-mill newcomer. He was hailed by the New York Times as the most likable of the recent wave of romantic adolescents. As the first outdoor Technicolor picture, 1930's Excess Trail of the Lonesome Pine, he proved he could accomplish more than just romance. His film presence was so convincing that audiences could almost feel what he was portraying. Among Hollywood's brightest stars in the late 1930s, he stood apart. His breakout role was as a young lawyer playing Abraham Lincoln in the 1939 film Young Mr. Lincoln. He began his lengthy partnership with filmmaker John Ford, and he brought a subtle firmness to Lincoln that anchored the character. In 1940, he tackled an even more daunting role as Tom Joad in The Grapes of Wrath. The film, which was based on a novel by John Steinbeck, depicted a man's struggle to ensure his family's survival amidst the Great Depression. The part was pivotal to Fonda's career, and he received his first Oscar nomination for it. He became more than simply a movie star because to his acting, which portrayed the everyday problems of Americans. A symbol of perseverance, he became. The versatility of Fonda's acting style allowed him to excel in westerns. For his role as the honorable and conscientious Frank James in Jesse James, 1939, he received enthusiastic critical acclaim. The Return of Frank James, 1940, was the sequel to the successful film. In 1940's Excess My Darling Clementine, he made a triumphant comeback to the genre as Wyatt Earp, a lawman reenacting the iconic shootout at the OK Corral. Although Fonda did portray heroes in her films, his 1943 work The Oxbow Incident dealt with the brutality of mob punishment. Fonda saw the perils of jumping to conclusions as a youngster, and the picture portrayed that. Many years later, in Once Upon a Time in the West, he delivered a performance that shocked audiences. The year 1968. In the role of Frank, a cold-blooded murderer without shame, director Sergio Leone cast him in contrast to his usual role. People were taken aback. To heighten the character's unsettling aura, Leone requested that Fonda's iconic blue eyes remain visible throughout the film. This portrayal by Fonda stood out due to the stark difference between her typical parts and that of this icy villain. 12 Angry Men, 1957, was one of Fonda's most striking performances outside of westerns. In the dramatic courtroom scene, he portrayed juror number 8, the sole individual who dared to challenge the jury's guilty judgment. Justice and reason were important themes of the picture, which Fonda conveyed with subtle passion. It wasn't for show. Justice was the central theme of his remarks. Asserting one's morality. He took a different tack than most of his contemporaries in the performing world. He was known as One Take Fonda because to his exceptional ability to succeed on the first try. He had done so much prep work that he was fully immersed in his role when the cameras began rolling. He read Steinbeck's book to get a feel for Tom Joad's plight in The Grapes of Wrath. He researched the life of the lawman Wyatt Earp by reading actual biographies to ensure his performance was true to the character. He avoided dramatic eruptions and showy acts. He instead brought a subtle power to his roles, which lent an air of authenticity to his portrayals. By the time World War II rolled along, Henry Fonda had already established himself as a Hollywood celebrity. He had established himself as a leading man after starring in 1940's The Grapes of Wrath. When the conflict broke out, though, he didn't care about any of it. He joined the United States Navy on August 22, 1942, when he was 37 years old. Like many performers before him, he might have remained in Hollywood and made war films. Still, it wasn't sufficient for him. "A studio war isn't something I'm interested in," he declared. He aspired to serve with all his heart. Fonda might have begun his career as an officer because of his college degree. Yet, he declined. He joined the Navy as an ordinary seaman, having the belief that he needed to demonstrate his worthiness just like any other guy. His hard work was appreciated. He went from private to lieutenant and was sent aboard the USS Curtis AV-4 in less than a year. After his time as an ACO, he moved on to become an OC in the Air Combat Intelligence Branch. Crucial engagements in the Pacific, such as Iwo Jima and the Marianas, were fought in which he participated. He was decorated with the Bronze Star for his outstanding service in the field of air operations planning. He put his acting career on hold to serve in the Navy, but what he gained from that experience will last a lifetime. He had changed much since his departure in 1945 when he returned. He had changed in the war. The horrors of war, including casualties, devastation, and brutality, were not new to him. An encounter like that doesn't simply go away. The disparity was most acutely felt by his family. His children, Peter and Jane Fonda, would come to characterize their dad as emotionally distant and aloof. For Jane, he instilled in her the belief that she needed to be flawless in order to receive his love. Their father never told them, "I love you," until Peter recalled this fact many years later. Frances Ford Seymour, his wife at the time, battled depression. The situation was exacerbated by Fonda's icy attitude. In 1950, Frances tragically took her own life, ending their marriage. His behavior shifted as well. His performances had more depth after the war, even if he had previously played reserved, determined characters. There was more depth to his performances, more feeling behind the surface. But his career took a nosedive despite his improved abilities. He went through a tough patch in the late 1940s. This was a turning point for Hollywood. As new stars emerged, Fonda found it challenging to land suitable parts. He abandoned low-budget flicks for Broadway. Mr. Roberts, based on the book by Thomas Hagen about life on a Navy cargo ship, was staged in 1948 and he played the major role. His emotions were echoed throughout the play. It lasted for more than 3 years and had 1,157 performances, reflecting his personal wartime experiences, and it was a huge hit. Tony Award-winning actor Henry Fonda proved he was still among the best in America when he took home the prize for Best Actor. John Ford and Henry Fonda collaborated on some of Hollywood's most iconic films. In 1940, they gave audiences The Grapes of Wrath, and in 1946, they gave audiences My Darling Clementine. Not only did these films feature their abilities, but they also had a significant impact on American cinematic history. Their work was remembered because of Fonda's nuanced and forceful performance and Ford's visually breathtaking storytelling. In 1940, viewers were deeply affected by the publication of The Grapes of Wrath. The film, which was based on the Pulitzer Prize-winning novel by John Steinbeck, followed the Joad family as they weathered the Great Depression. Tom, portrayed by Fonda with calm resolve, was both tragic and inspirational. An Oscar nomination for Best Actor was bestowed to him for his performance. With its initial gross of $1.1 million, the picture was a smashing hit. For that era, that was an enormous sum. The picture went beyond being merely a narrative when Ford was named Best Director at the Academy Awards. It was an appeal to perseverance, fairness, and optimism. My Darling Clementine was Ford and Fonda's second collaboration, this time taking place 6 years later. Reimagining the gunfight at the OK Corral, Fonda portrayed Wyatt Earp this time. The way he portrayed Earp was both fantastical and grounded in reality. The narrative meant something to Ford personally. Many years ago, he had conversed with the genuine Wyatt Earp and heard him recount the infamous gunfight. By drawing on those recollections, Ford transformed the picture into a groundbreaking Western. A lyrical and realistic portrayal of the Old West was given to viewers by the film's blending of fact and myth. Their working relationship was rocky, in contrast to the polished and professional films they made. Ford was known for his severe and often ruthless treatment of his employees. He was anticipating total command of the set. If he didn't understand, he would become angry. Fonda never warmed up to Ford because of his character, but she did like his skill. Their union grew increasingly tense as time went on. Their collaboration on Mr. Roberts in 1955 was the last straw. The part that Henry Fonda played in Mr. Roberts on Broadway was a watershed event in his career. On February 18, 1948, the stage adaptation of the novel by Thomas Hagen debuted. Up to January 6, 1951, it had an astounding 1,157 appearances. During World War II, Fonda portrayed the character of Lieutenant Douglas Roberts, a naval officer stranded aboard a cargo ship. He felt obligated to do his job, but he was also frustrated that he wasn't fighting. Tony Award-winning actor Henry Fonda was recognized for his strong performance. He felt a strong connection to the job. The fact that he had been a lieutenant in the United States Navy during the conflict added credence to his portrayal. Despite his stage success, Warner Brothers passed on casting him in the film version. After a long absence from Hollywood, Fonda returned to the industry in the early 1950s at the age of 49. His age was considered a problem by the studio while casting for the position of junior-grade lieutenant. After being absent for so long, they were also skeptical of his capacity to captivate crowds. Warner Brothers preferred to cast younger actors, such as William Holden or Marlon Brando. Even though director John Ford was adamant about casting just himself for the part. He thought Fonda was the one actor capable of giving Roberts life on screen. His doggedness landed Fonda the role, but it also caused major issues throughout filming. Warner Brothers continued to have reservations following Fonda's casting. They collaborated extensively with Ford to alter plot points so that Mr. Roberts might appeal to the widest potential audience. Aspects of Captain Morton's demeanor and other darker characteristics were toned down. Technical decisions were also dictated by the studio. The company changed its mind about filming Mr. Roberts in 3D utilizing Warner's Superscope. 3D had already fallen out of favor before filming began, so they opted instead for CinemaScope. This change made an already challenging shoot even more so. Fonda and Ford, meanwhile, had an early and ongoing feud. Among Hollywood's greats, John Ford stands tall. Despite helming some of cinema's all-time classics, he was quite the character when he was behind the camera. Unpredictable, violent, and erratic were some of his traits. His 1954 appearance on Mr. Roberts' stage was one of the most notorious events of his career. It was intended that the film would serve as a seamless adaptation from the theater. Rather, it turned into a battlefield. Henry Fonda was very invested in the film version as he had portrayed the lead on Broadway. Performing in it wasn't his only role. It was important to him that it do homage to the original play. A glitch, nevertheless, did exist. His stomach turned at Ford's rewrite of the screenplay. Compared to the successful stage play, he felt it was missing the comedic timing and emotional depth. After Fonda told producer Leland Hayward about his issues, Hayward set up a meeting between Fonda and the filmmaker. It was a disaster. As Fonda detailed his problems with the screenplay, Ford sat back with a drink in hand and listened. Fonda was about to speak when Ford sprang to his feet and attacked him. Without any delay. Suddenly, their conversation on the film had taken a completely different turn. Their 8-film professional collaboration and 16-year friendship had come to an end. Even after Ford issued an apology, it was ineffective. He remained unforgiven by Fonda. He saw that as the last straw that broke their friendship, and he never collaborated with Ford again. What was more important than the punch itself was the information it disclosed. While Ford's unpredictable and frequently vicious conduct was nothing new, it had reached new heights on this occasion. He allegedly consumed a case of beer daily while filming. For many, the episode served to reaffirm prior knowledge. Even though he had the makings of a tyrant, Ford was a master director. Not only did he have an erratic personality, but so did Fonda. The film's Captain Morton, James Cagney, had his own conflicts with the filmmaker. Filming had hardly yet begun when the anxiety began. Ford stared Cagney down at the airport when they initially met and declared, "We're going to tangle asses." I was being serious. Ford was notorious for putting his performers through their paces and pushing them to their limits. On the other hand, Cagney never backed down. A little tardy, he showed up on day one of filming. That was sufficient justification for Ford. He publicly scolded Cagney in front of the whole crew, but Cagney refused to be embarrassed. "You promised we'd get into a tangle before this was over," he added, interrupting Ford mid-rant. "I'm prepared." Is that so? That was unexpected by Ford. Even after he recoiled, the animosity persisted. According to Cagney's subsequent account, Ford was a cruel old guy who was really harsh with everyone on production. Cagney, Fonda, and Jack Lemmon were all feeling the tension in the air. Ford's actions were impacting the entire production, not just himself. Ford ended up in the hospital not long after striking Fonda. He had to have his gallbladder removed because his drinking had gotten the best of him. He had to be replaced by Warner Brothers. A seasoned director with a reputation for dependability, Mervyn LeRoy was hired, which was precisely what the production required. A new tack was taken by Leroy. Although Leroy stayed true to the play, Ford wanted a more wide humor and irreverence for the picture. There was a discernible change in tone, and some were unhappy about it. The finished result was apparently unpopular with Ford and Fonda. Despite facing all these challenges, Mr. Roberts achieved remarkable achievement. Its $2 million budget was more than covered by its $21 million box office haul. Although Warner Brothers achieved their goal, Fonda found the process to be draining. Although he had battled valiantly to retain the job, the production put his patience to the last test. The film's success belied the fact that he endured intense strife, frustration, and the loss of a significant friendship throughout its production. Much like his on-screen personas, Henry Fonda's private life was a roller coaster of emotions. He showed a new side to himself in each of his 5 marriages. Actress Margaret Sullivan was his first wife, and they were only married for a short time in 1931. Their personalities were at odds right from the beginning. Fonda was shy and timid, in contrast to Sullivan's ferocity and candor. Their constant bickering led to the rapid dissolution of their marriage. He wed the Canadian-American socialite Frances Ford Seymour in 1936. The Fonda children, Jane and Peter, were born within this marriage, which endured far longer and produced 2 famous Hollywood actors. However, problems crept into the partnership. Both Frances and Fonda had problems with mental health, and Fonda especially was emotionally aloof. He informed her he wanted a divorce in 1949 after 13 years of marriage, citing his infatuation with another lady. Susan Blanchard, who was 20 years his junior, was that lady. Already struggling with depression, Frances was crushed. She sought treatment at Craig House Sanitarium. It was too much, the treachery. She committed suicide on April 14, 1950, after stealing a razor from the institution. While Peter was 10 years old, Jane was 12. Their mother had passed away from heart failure, Fonda informed them. Even at her funeral, he insisted they not attend. They bought into the deception for a long time. He wed Susan Blanchard later that year as well. They broke up soon after. She compared herself to a geisha thereafter, saying she felt pressured to please him constantly despite his icy demeanor. Their marriage came to an end after 5 years. In 1957, he wed Afterra Franchetti, an Italian baroness, marking his 4th marriage. By 1961, that marriage had broken down. He wed for the 6th and last time in 1965. He wed Shirley May Adams again, and the couple remained married until he passed away in 1982. However, at that point, his family had already been profoundly affected by the wounds caused by his previous relationships. Both Jane and Peter had fathers who were emotionally distant. Peter subsequently recalled Fonda's accusation that he had stolen chocolates, as well as disciplined him in a manner that instilled fear in him. Having her self-perception impacted by her father's ideals of beauty, Jane had a hard time accepting herself. Even further estrangement ensued when Fonda took the kids to boarding schools or had them live with relatives following their mother's death. Some years later, they were able to put the past in the past. Peter had never before spoken those words to Fonda, but he told him he loved him just before he passed away. The emotional scars from their relationship never completely healed, but Jane also made peace with it. One of Henry Fonda's most moving performances came at the age of 76. The 1981 picture on Golden Pond wasn't your average fare. It was an intimate tale about growing old, loved ones, and letting go of the past. An elderly professor confronting the realities of his twilight years, Fonda portrayed Norman Thayer, Jr. Jane Fonda, who was his actual daughter, played the role of his estranged daughter in the film, which added authenticity to their on-screen bond. The 54th Academy Awards, for which he won Best Actor, were his first and only. He was the oldest recipient of the honor to that point in time. He was already in the midst of a health crisis. So, he was unable to partake in the ritual. Pretending to receive the Oscar on his behalf, Jane said that her father would likely simply grin and think, "Well, ain't I lucky?" Henry Fonda was encapsulated in that one fleeting, unremarkable moment. At the North American box office, the picture earned $119.3 million, making it the second most grossing picture of 1981. It received 10 Oscar nominations and took home 3 of them. Awards for Best Actor, Fonda; Best Actress, Hepburn; and Best Adapted Screenplay, Thompson, Ernest. Still, Fonda's unfiltered candor was the show-stopping element that created On Golden Pond. Because it was genuine, his performance seemed authentic. He had prostate cancer and cardiac difficulties, so his health was bad. And his last reserves were fully invested in the job. It was essentially a goodbye message to the world as it was his final theatrical release. His legacy, however, was already guaranteed. He was a leading man in some of cinema's seminal works from decades ago. He portrayed the sole male juror in a 1957 murder trial who was prepared to cast doubt on the jury's decision in 12 Angry Men. An emotionally charged and suspenseful examination of morality and justice, the film was directed by Sidney Lumet. The performance by Fonda was nuanced and impactful. Big speeches and spectacular gestures weren't necessary for him. He did nothing more than sit there, unfazed by the bias and uncertainty around him. He became the film's protagonist due of his calm resolve. Then, in 1968, he pulled a stunt that nobody saw coming. The cold-blooded killer Frank in Sergio Leone's Once Upon a Time in the West was cast by him. This role was totally at odds with Fonda's previous work. People often saw him in the role of the heroic hero, the one who fought for justice. He was scary in this flick, though. Previously appearing thoughtful and sympathetic, his blue eyes suddenly appeared icy and ruthless. The film was an homage/deconstruction to the traditional Western. Much of that was due to Fonda's performance. Fonda proved he was more than simply a leading man with his portrayals as the unyielding moral compass of 12 irate men and the terrifying antagonist in Once Upon a Time in the West. He had the ability to totally reinvent himself as an actor, which allowed him to take chances. He left an impression on everyone with his final performance in On Golden Pond, which solidified his status as one of the most legendary performers of all time. He left an indelible impression even in his last scenes.